Moving to this neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start, a peaceful retreat after years of hard work, a place where I could finally breathe without the constant noise of city life. I chose this quiet community for its promise of serenity, wide open spaces, and friendly neighbors. It was the kind of place where people smiled as they watered their lawns, where you could sip coffee on your porch and hear nothing but birds singing and the soft rustle of leaves. I thought I had found my slice of heaven, a home where I could relax, unwind, and spend my days without anyone telling me what I could or couldn't do with my own property. That is, until I met her. Karen. She didn't show up right away. No, at first it was quiet. Too quiet. Then, about a week after I moved in, there she was, standing at the edge of my driveway like a vulture eyeing its prey. Clipboard clutched in her hand, a permanent scowl etched into her face, and a condescending smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm with the HOA," she said, voice as cold as ice. "I need to discuss a few things about your property." That was the beginning of the nightmare. It didn't take long to realize that Karen wasn't just a member of the HOA. She was the HOA. At least, that's how she saw it. She wielded the rule book like a sword, striking down anything that didn't meet her impossible standards. It started small, a comment about the color of my garden hose, a raised eyebrow at my choice of lawn ornaments, but quickly spiraled into something more sinister. One afternoon I was in my driveway, adding a simple gravel extension so I could park my truck without blocking the main road. It wasn't anything fancy, just a bit of extra space so I wouldn't have to squeeze into a tight spot every time I came home. But the moment Karen saw me with a shovel in hand, she was on me like a hawk. "That's unauthorized construction," she barked, jabbing a finger at the gravel. "All exterior modifications need HOA approval." I calmly explained that this was my property. The driveway was on my land, not part of any communal road, but Karen wasn't having it. She pulled out her rulebook, flipping dramatically through the pages until she found some vague reference about community aesthetics and roadway access. "This driveway extension violates the look and feel of the neighborhood," she snapped. "If you don't remove it, I'll have to escalate this to the board." I tried to reason with her, showed her the property lines, explained that I wasn't on HOA-owned land, but it was like talking to a brick wall. Karen didn't care about facts. She cared about control. I thought that would be the end of it. I genuinely believed that once Karen saw the gravel wasn't bothering anyone, she'd move on to some other petty issue. But I underestimated just how far she was willing to go. The next morning I woke up, grabbed a cup of coffee and headed outside, only to stop dead in my tracks. There, blocking my driveway, was a cinder block wall. A solid, shoulder-high barrier of gray concrete, running straight across the end of my driveway, completely cutting off my access to the road. My truck was trapped behind it. No way in, no way out. I just stood there, stunned. Who does something like this? It wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was intentional, calculated. As I got closer, I noticed the cement was still drying, the work clearly done overnight. Taped to the wall was a note, signed of course by Karen, stating that the HOA had voted to close off unauthorized access points in the community and that my driveway extension had been corrected per their rules. My blood boiled. This wasn't just petty, this was insane. She had literally built a wall across my property, trapping my vehicle, and then had the nerve to act like it was some kind of official enforcement action. The worst part wasn't the wall itself, it was the way it made me feel. Violated. Helpless. There's something deeply unsettling about waking up to find someone has physically altered your property without your consent. It wasn't just about the inconvenience, it was about the sheer audacity of it. I stood there, staring at that wall, realizing that Karen didn't see me as a neighbor. She saw me as an outsider, someone she needed to control, to push out if I didn't fall in line. I couldn't just brush it off. This wasn't an annoying fine over a mailbox color or a warning about grass height. This was a violation of my basic rights. And for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I didn't feel safe. I felt cornered. It's a terrible thing, to feel like a prisoner on your own property. I couldn't just let this go, something had to be done. But I knew I couldn't fight this alone. So I picked up the phone and called an old friend. "Mark, a retired property lawyer who knew every legal loophole and homeowner's right like the back of his hand. I explained everything: the driveway, Karen's threats, the cinder block wall, and sent him pictures. There was a long silence on the other end before Mark finally spoke. "She's committed multiple violations," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is property damage, false imprisonment, and illegal construction without a permit. She's not just breaking HOA rules, she's breaking the law." That was the moment the tide started to turn. Mark explained exactly what we needed to do: gather evidence, document everything, and prepare a legal case against Karen and, if necessary, the HOA. But what struck me most was the way Mark emphasized one key point: bullies like Karen thrive on intimidation. They rely on people staying quiet, on neighbors being too scared to speak up. If I wanted justice, I had to be louder than Karen's threats. Fueled by Mark's advice, I decided it was time to confront Karen head-on, but not just for me. I started knocking on doors, talking to neighbors, asking if they'd ever had similar run-ins with Karen. What I found was shocking: story after story of intimidation, petty fines, and threats disguised as community enforcement. A widow down the street told me Karen once threatened to report her for excessive garden decorations. An older man admitted he'd been fined for having his American flag too large. And the most heartbreaking: a couple shared how Karen had bullied them into removing a small wheelchair ramp for their disabled son, claiming it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. I realized this wasn't just my fight. Karen had been tormenting the entire community for years. People were scared of her, afraid that speaking out would only make things worse. But there was one thing Karen hadn't counted on: the fact that, when pushed too far, even the quietest neighbors would find their voice. I didn't waste a second. With Mark's guidance, I documented everything: the cinder block wall, the note Karen left, and even the still-drying cement. I took pictures from every angle, making sure every detail was clear. The more I looked at that wall, the more furious I became. This wasn't just Karen flexing her authority. This was a calculated move to humiliate me, to send a message that she controlled this neighborhood. But what Karen didn't realize was that every brick she laid, every ounce of concrete she poured, was another piece of evidence stacked against her. I wasn't just collecting proof, I was building a case. I even filmed a video, calmly explaining what had happened while showing the wall, the note, and the property line markers. I wanted to make sure there was no room for Karen to twist the truth later. I wasn't going to give her a single inch. But something unexpected happened as I gathered evidence. The neighbors started to notice. I saw curtains twitching, doors cracking open just enough for curious eyes to peek through. One by one, people stepped outside, whispering among themselves as they watched me take photos. At first, they kept their distance, but then a woman named Linda approached me. She was older, probably in her 70s, with a soft voice and kind eyes. "She did the same thing to my son," she said quietly. "Blocked off his driveway because he parked a trailer there for a few days." I could hear the pain in her voice, the same helplessness I had felt when I first saw the wall. And then another neighbor spoke up, a man named Greg, who told me Karen had once tried to fine him for having his porch light too bright. "She threatened to report me for light pollution," he scoffed, shaking his head. The floodgates opened. Story after story poured out. Karen's harassment wasn't a one-time thing. She had spent years weaponizing the HOA rules, using them not to protect the community, but to control it. That night, I realized I wasn't alone. Karen had bullied an entire neighborhood into silence, but now, for the first time, people were ready to fight back. And I knew exactly where to start. I printed a petition demanding Karen's immediate removal from the HOA board, outlining her abuse of power, and requesting an emergency meeting. But I didn't stop there. I made sure everyone who signed it understood why we were doing this. It wasn't just about my driveway or Greg's porch light. It was about taking back control from someone who had turned a peaceful community into her personal kingdom. As I went door to door, I saw fear slowly turn into courage. Neighbors who once whispered about Karen's antics now spoke openly, and signatures poured in faster than I expected. By the time I reached the last house on the street, The petition wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of unity. Karen wasn't going to push us around anymore. The very next day, I filed a formal complaint with the county. Mark helped me prepare a legal notice, clearly outlining the property violations, the false imprisonment by blocking my vehicle, and the illegal construction of the wall. But that wasn't the only surprise I had for Karen. With Mark's advice, I also contacted the sheriff's department. This wasn't just an HOA dispute. Karen had broken the law, and I wasn't going to let her hide behind the flimsy shield of community rules. That afternoon, a deputy accompanied me to Karen's house. I knocked, calmly but firmly, and when Karen opened the door, her smirk quickly faded as she saw the uniformed officer standing beside me. "Karen," I said, holding up the legal papers, "you're in violation of multiple property laws. You've illegally blocked my driveway, damaged my property, and falsely imprisoned my vehicle. This ends now." The deputy didn't have to say a word. His presence alone was enough to send Karen into a flustered panic. She tried to argue, claiming it was an HOA enforcement action, but the deputy cut her off. "This is a criminal matter now," he said. "You need to remove the wall immediately or face legal consequences." Karen's face went pale. For the first time, she realized she had crossed a line that her HOA title couldn't protect her from. But Karen, being Karen, wasn't about to go down without a fight. That night, she called an emergency HOA meeting, a desperate attempt to regain control. The meeting hall was packed, with neighbors crammed into every chair, some standing along the walls. Karen stood at the front, her voice a sharp bark as she flipped through a stack of papers. "This man is a threat to our community," she declared, pointing a finger at me like I was some kind of criminal. "He refuses to follow the rules, disrespects the HOA. And now he's bringing in lawyers and law enforcement to bully us." The room was silent, but not for the reason Karen expected. I watched as neighbors exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. Karen was waiting for applause, for cheers of support, but all she got was cold, quiet stares. And then the HOA president, a man named Tom, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "Karen," he said, "are you seriously suggesting you're the victim here after illegally building a wall on someone's private property?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. And that's when it hit her. The room wasn't on her side. The very people she had bullied, fined, and threatened for years were no longer afraid. Another neighbor, an older gentleman named Frank, stood up. "He lives here, Karen," he said. "He's not an outsider. You're the one abusing your power." One by one, people began nodding, some murmuring their agreement. Karen's face twisted, part shock, part fury. She wasn't just losing control. She was losing her grip on the entire neighborhood. But the final blow came when Tom announced that a vote would be held, right there, right then, to decide Karen's fate on the HOA board. It wasn't just about removing her from power. It was about reclaiming the community. The vote was quick and devastating for Karen. An overwhelming majority voted for her immediate removal, stripping her of any authority within the HOA. Karen didn't say a word. She just stood there, her face burning red, as her once loyal neighbors turned their backs on her. It was over. Yet even as Karen's world crumbled, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done. I knew people like Karen didn't go quietly. They went kicking and screaming, clinging to whatever scraps of power they had left. But what Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about an entire community that had finally found its voice. And there was no way we were ever letting Karen silence us again. The night after the vote, the air in the neighborhood felt different. Lighter, freer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. People like her didn't just disappear quietly. No, Karen was the type to claw and scratch until the bitter end. And I had a sinking suspicion she was already plotting her next move. I sat on my porch, sipping a cup of coffee, watching the sun sink behind the trees, when I noticed something. A familiar figure storming down the street, clipboard in hand, knocking on doors. Karen. She was gathering signatures, but for what I didn't know. At each house, her voice grew louder, her gestures wilder. I could hear snippets of her ranting about outsiders and lawlessness, painting me as a dangerous influence, a threat to the so-called harmony of the community. It was clear, she wasn't trying to win back the HOA. She was trying to rally her own faction, hoping to build an army of like-minded followers to keep her reign of terror alive, even without the official title. But there was one thing Karen didn't realize. People had seen the truth. They had seen her crumble at the emergency meeting, had witnessed her illegal actions firsthand. And most importantly, they were no longer afraid of her. I watched neighbor after neighbor shake their heads, some closing their doors in her face, others refusing to even acknowledge her presence. Karen's grip on the community wasn't just slipping, it was gone. But Karen didn't stop there. The next morning, I woke up to something even more outrageous. My truck, the same truck that had been trapped behind her cinder block wall just days ago, was gone. Vanished from my driveway. At first, I thought maybe I was losing my mind, but the empty space where my truck had been parked was impossible to miss. Panic surged through me, but it wasn't long before I found the answer. I checked my home security cameras, and there it was. In the dead of night, Karen had hired a tow truck. She stood there, arms crossed, watching with a self-satisfied smirk as the truck was hauled away. It wasn't an official repossession. There were no legal notices, no warnings. It was theft, plain and simple. Karen had taken it upon herself to enforce her version of the rules, even after losing her power in the HOA. She was still trying to punish me, to send a message that she could do whatever she wanted. But this time she didn't just cross the line, she obliterated it. I didn't hesitate. With the security footage as undeniable proof, I grabbed my phone and called the sheriff directly. My voice was calm, but my blood was boiling. "I need to report a stolen vehicle," I said. "And I know exactly who took it." The response was swift. Within 15 minutes, a patrol car pulled into my driveway, the same deputy who had forced Karen to remove the spike strips just days earlier. He didn't even look surprised when I told him what happened. "Let me guess," he said with a sigh. "Karen." I showed him the footage. Karen standing smugly beside the tow truck as it hauled my vehicle away. The deputy's jaw tightened. "She had no legal right to do this," he muttered. "Where do you think they took it?" I already had a pretty good idea. There was a private impound lot about 5 miles away, not city-run, but tied to a shady towing company that Karen likely had connections with through her HOA ties. The deputy nodded. "Let's go get your truck back, and have a little talk with Karen while we're at it." When we pulled up to the impound lot, sure enough there was my truck, parked behind a chain-link fence, locked up like I was some criminal who had violated a parking law. A grizzled man in grease-stained overalls stepped out of a small office, squinting at us. "Something I can help you with," he grunted. The deputy wasted no time. "This truck was illegally towed from private property," he said. "We're here to get it back." The man scratched his beard, clearly annoyed. "Some lady said it was an unauthorized vehicle," he muttered. I stepped forward. "Unauthorized according to who?" Snap. "I have legal proof that my driveway is private property, not under HOA jurisdiction." The man held up his hands. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said. "If you've got proof, I'll release the truck, but you'll have to pay the impound fee." The deputy's face hardened. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "That truck never should have been taken in the first place. If you want to avoid charges for participating in an illegal repossession, I suggest you waive the fee now." The man paled, quickly unlocking the gate. Fine, he muttered. "Take it. Just keep that crazy woman away from me." With my truck back, there was only one thing left to do. The deputy and I drove straight to Karen's house. She must have seen us pull up because the moment the deputy stepped out of his car, she flung open her front door, a fake smile plastered on her face. "Oh, officer," she cooed. "What seems to be the problem?" But the moment I held up my phone and played the security footage, Karen standing beside the tow truck, smugly overseeing the theft, her smile dropped like a stone. "You stole my truck," I said, my voice steady but sharp. That's grand theft auto. Karen's eyes widened. It wasn't theft, she stammered. It was a community enforcement action. The HOA rules clearly state. The deputy cut her off. The HOA has no authority over private property, he said. You don't get to enforce anything. What you did was a felony, and now you're going to pay for it. Then the words Karen never expected to hear. Karen, you're under arrest for vehicle theft. Turn around. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. No, this is ridiculous. You can't do this, she screeched. But the deputy ignored her protests, calmly cuffing her hands behind her back. You have the right to remain silent, he began, reciting her Miranda rights as the entire neighborhood slowly gathered outside. People whispered, some even recording the scene on their phones. The mighty Karen, the queen of the HOA, was being led to a patrol car like a common criminal. And me. I stood there, arms crossed, watching her meltdown with a calm, satisfied grin. Told you this wasn't over, Karen, I said softly, just loud enough for her to hear. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and merciless. The HOA board scrambled to distance themselves from Karen. Public statements were issued. Hollow apologies claiming they never condoned her actions, insisting the illegal towing was a personal decision not tied to the HOA. But it didn't matter. Karen's reign was over. She was hit with multiple criminal charges, faced thousands in legal fees, and was permanently banned from any future involvement in the HOA. The neighbors, once too scared to speak, now openly condemned her, their fear replaced with relief. And me. I finally had my driveway back, clear, open, and free of cinder block walls and Karen's interference. But more than that, the neighborhood had changed. The unspoken tension that had hovered over our community for years was gone. Karen's arrest wasn't just justice for me. It was freedom for everyone she had tormented. And as I stood there, watching the last of the legal notices be removed from my door, I realized something important. Bullies like Karen only have power when people stay silent. But once you stand up, once you shine a light on their actions, their power crumbles like a poorly built wall. Karen thought she owned this neighborhood. She thought she was untouchable. But in the end, the law and the community reminded her of one simple truth. No one is above justice.